Thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you to UTS, the Centre for Media Transition, the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'm going to speak about my education on journalism ethics and how that played out for me on the road. Growing up here in Perth, I didn't know any journalists apart from football writers because my dad worked in football, let alone knowing anyone who'd even travelled to the places I wanted to go. I just read about them in books and I saw them on the SBS World News. But apart from a desire to travel and explore, I believed that this profession, journalism, would be an effective way of doing good in the world. So that was the why behind everything I did. And for the past 2 decades, this key belief drove and shaped the many complex and difficult ethical decisions I had to make along the way. Many of the decisions I've taken might be in contrast to what is typically expected of reporters. My journalism education was quite unique. It began in 1999 as a high school student when I first learned about the history of the occupation of East Timor as the country prepared to vote for its freedom. In awe of the reporting that exposed the abuses and war crimes committed by Indonesian forces and helped set that path to independence in motion, I decided firmly that journalism was the career for me. And I didn't want to wait until I finished high school and uni to start. So I sold hundreds of Freddo Frogs to pay for an airfare. I borrowed my public high school's new video camera and I set off to Dili, which was still rebuilding after the violence and scorched earth policy carried out by those pro-Indonesian militias. I set about trying to film a short documentary about an American doctor who was treating over 500 patients a day with limited supplies. The East Timorese might have their freedom, but they were dying of TB, malaria, dengue, and other preventable diseases. And here came my first big ethical dilemma. On one of the last days of filming with this doctor, one of the nurses came in to tell him that the clinic's midwife had just died from malaria. Distraught by the news, the exhausted doctor sat back from his chair and told the nurse that he needed a minute before the next patient. And I was rolling on my mini DV camera as this all played out in front of me. So should I stop filming? He wanted a moment, but he hadn't asked me to stop recording, and it was a really powerful scene. I decided to keep filming for a short moment until I got the shots that I needed to make it work. And then I gave the doctor a little hug and walked out to give him some time alone to grieve. Having never received any formal journalism training at the time, I just did what felt right, my heart and my gut leading the way. I chose not to study journalism. I did a year of international relations in Indonesian at uni before a stroke of luck got my foot in the door with SBS in Sydney when I was 18. They'd hired me to film one short project and I found an excuse to just never leave the building. So I spent the next few years literally growing up in a newsroom, watching and learning from brilliant journalists like Mark Davis, Olivia Rousset, David O'Shea, Martin Butler, John Martinkus, Bronwyn Adcock, Carmela Baranowska, Amos Roberts, Mike Carey. I also, at that time, completed a 1-year journalism cadetship with SBS, and that didn't include any in-depth formal training on ethics, though there was one session on the MWEA Code of Ethics. I have no memory of this, but my former cadet coordinator assures me that we did cover it. So it was really these weekly Dateline editorial meetings at SBS that were just an incredible masterclass in ethical decision-making in journalism. There were these vigorous, passionate debates over what we could say, what evidence we had, how far we could push it, what was accurate and what was fair. I remember having front row access to a fascinating debate around whether Dateline should broadcast new pictures that had just emerged of US soldiers torturing prisoners at Abu Ghraib. Reporter Olivia Rousset had a global scoop. No US publication was going to broadcast them. And we knew that Dateline would be accused of endangering the lives of coalition forces in Iraq. But the decision was made that these had to be public. I also learned firsthand about the fierce need for journalists to protect their sources. I was asked by Dateline to take a long train journey to a random stop in the middle of nowhere and to wait for someone to hand me a disc of these new explosive Abu Ghraib photos. And I knew not to ask any questions. It's a really hard thing to learn, how to assess when your sources are at risk and how you can protect them. And it's one of the most important ethical lessons you need as an investigative journalist. And when I was working on my first big investigation, which was into the shooting deaths of 5 children at the hands of Australian forces in Afghanistan, I was approached by a defence whistleblower. Unsure and stressed about making any rookie mistakes that could expose my source, I ended up cold calling the expert, Nick McKenzie at The Age, who generously gave me a quick rundown. I had to buy a burner phone. I had to call them from a payphone. So, thank God these days for encrypted apps and encrypted email. When I was 20, I moved to Beirut just as Lebanon was rebuilding after the '06 war with Israel. And within a few weeks of arriving, there was a series of targeted assassinations of anti-Syrian figures, as well as near nightly clashes and shootings on the streets between those who were opposed to Hezbollah's influence and the militant group's supporters. I was working as a video journalist for Dateline, and one morning I went to go and interview the family of the first young man to be killed in this new violence. I'd set up and was about to do the interview when the BBC team arrived to do the same interview, to speak with the same family. I offered to let them start filming and asking questions too at the same time. The brother of the man killed was sobbing and he was absolutely beside himself with grief. He wanted to talk, but it seemed unnecessary to make him go through the whole process twice when he was so clearly distressed. So it was a relief when the BBC agreed. That might seem like common sense, but reporters can often be really competitive, and it wasn't a given that they would agree to work together, even if it meant re-traumatizing someone. Visiting Gaza for the first time that year, I was filming in the southern part of the Strip when we learnt that an airstrike nearby had killed a car full of young men. And my fixer Rad and I raced to the Khan Yunis hospital. I remember filming a sobbing teenage boy as he walked into the ER carrying a plastic bag that contained the mangled remains of his best friend. That was all that was left. And inside the hospital, distraught families were just beside themselves with grief. I stood back and my instinct was to try respectfully to capture the distressing scene without shoving my camera into anyone's face. But suddenly the crowd pushed me inside behind the curtain and to a medical trolley where doctors were frantically trying to save a young man who had had everything from his waist down blown away. It was my first experience of what would become common for me in the Middle East. The crowd demanding that I be right in their faces, filming close up to show the world what was being done to them. And sometimes that desire from the crowd went against your instincts to try and give people some dignity in those moments, but you had no choice but to give them that opportunity to express their pain through you. And that might look offensive to the bystander, journalists filming and photographing these intimate scenes of grief really closely. But ethics in journalism is often about context. And in Gaza in particular, many Palestinians saw the presence of reporters as a way of honouring their dead by recording their stories and making sure people knew about it. I'm not a big fan of military embeds. I believe it can predispose reporters to capturing only a very narrow perspective of a conflict. So I do have ethical concerns about accepting them. But in 2007, it was the only way to bear witness to the Pakistani army's fight against the Taliban in the northern border regions near Afghanistan. So I went up on one of the Pakistani army helicopters to the north, and the commander proudly showed me villages where they had claimed to defeat the Taliban. The only issue was that there was absolutely nothing left. Dozens of houses were destroyed by artillery rounds, mortar rounds, airstrikes. The residents had all been evacuated, the soldiers told me, but there really was not 1 inch left of this village for them to return to. So what did the local people think of what the army had done, I asked. Oh, they support our mission, the commander reassured me. It's not easy when you're in a conflict zone to leave your military escort and independently and safely seek out information and verify it. But I do believe it's incumbent of reporters who do embeds to do that. So this was an area that was controlled intermittently by the Taliban and where phone and internet access was incredibly difficult. But thanks to my excellent local fixer Mushtaq, we discovered that some of the families from that area were living in an IDP camp on the outskirts of Peshawar. Peshawar was not particularly safe to visit at the time because the Taliban was openly operating in the city. So we just made a very quick visit to this camp, keeping a low profile. And of course, once we found the families and interviewed them, they told us the opposite of what the Pakistani military claimed. They were outraged their village had been destroyed, and they absolutely did not support the army's mission. So it was a really important lesson for me to always seek out that other side. I remember my fixer Mushtaq was really worried about how long we could spend in that camp in Peshawar. He was very stressed about our safety, even though we were literally in and out in about 20 minutes or half an hour, as I madly filmed trying to get as much as I could, because I knew that if Mushtaq was worried, we had to be extra careful. To me, having a good relationship with your local fixer is the key behind so much crucial decision-making on the road. Acknowledging that they do know best and deferring to them when it comes to difficult decisions around how to keep everyone in your team and those who you're interviewing safe. especially after you leave, because that's a responsibility reporters have to take on. We're more likely to be from Western countries, to be white, and to have an enormous amount of privilege, power, and sway. So part of our job is to acknowledge that and to treat our local staff who are far more vulnerable with respect and to have their safety at the centre too. When operating in the West Bank, particularly during protests and if there was any shooting or arrests were being made, my producer Fuad and I had an agreement that he would melt away if I got close to Israeli soldiers. Because if they lashed out and wanted to arrest or punish anyone, Fuad was the easy target, not me. I had to ensure he wasn't around or he would have borne the brunt of their aggression. When I was in Brazil filming in a tiny town in the middle of the Amazon, I wanted to question the local mayor about his links to illegal loggers, but my fixer refused to translate my tough questions. He was worried about his safety and his ability to work in that area in the future. While at the time I was really annoyed, on further reflection, it was absolutely his call to make. This was his country, his future. I was just one more white journalist who'd parachuted in to cover the story. And I do feel that that parachute model has its pitfalls. I followed the recent debate around the April trip to Myanmar by CNN's Clarissa Ward, where she was given special permission to enter the country by the generals who'd just overthrown the democratically elected government and an exclusive chance to interview them. And some Burmese reporters were quite upset by this trip because they felt it didn't really expose any new horrors that they hadn't already been documenting for months, at great personal risk with several killed and dozens arrested, or that the trip really did anything to hold the junta to account, and that it actually could have provided the generals with some of the legitimacy that they craved. 11 civilians that Ward interviewed were reportedly detained by Myanmar security forces soon after they spoke to her in front of military minders. 8 were later released, and I couldn't find reports of what happened to the other 3. So I do think these days we need to do less parachuting, have less obsession with our man or our woman on the ground, and empower local reporters more, who have a far deeper understanding of the situation and more obligation to act ethically. They don't just cut and run. The decisions around deciding who to ask to film inside Syria were quite difficult, particularly as the siege of Aleppo wore on and Russian and Syrian government airstrikes and helicopter barrel bombs specifically targeted civilian infrastructure. And this was repeated in Ghouta. The young fixers I was using to film footage for the ABC were still keen to keep going out and filming. But as just even venturing outside became a death wish, I no longer wanted to ask them to go. The risk of injury or death was, by that stage, was just extremely high. But they still wanted to go, to show the world what was happening, and they still went, whether I commissioned them or not. And one of the shooters I used in Ghouta told me how the sudden lack of filming requests made him feel abandoned and unwanted during his worst hours. And even when they did go out to film, I'll never forget what one of my contacts told me after spending the day trying to film in Aleppo during the last days of the siege there. For the first time, residents were refusing to let him film them. For 5 years, we've been filmed and we've been seen killed, they told him. What has changed? Now we just want to die in peace. I felt deep shame admitting they were right. During these times of smaller teams, less bureaus, tighter deadlines, and more programs to file for, the pressure to get the story can feel like the solitary objective that overrides everything else. How much time do you have to think about the ethical decisions you make when you've just arrived somewhere intense and you're thinking about what to file for radio news, AM, online, 7 p.m., 7:30? Oh, can you also live tweet along the way? It's intense. I remember landing on the Greek island of Lesbos in the summer of 2015. It was a big story, a modern exodus of biblical proportions, as more than 800,000 people fled from Syria to Europe. After spending years being bombed and slaughtered by their own government, Syrians gave up waiting for the rest of the world to help them. So they walked, they got buses, they made their way to the Turkish coast and found a smuggler to put them on a boat going to any of the Greek islands. So I stood on the shores of Lesbos watching boat after boat roll in. 30,000 people had landed there just in the past fortnight before I arrived. And my task was to film a news package, to do an AM package, to do a cross, and also start filming a longer piece for 7:30. So it was quite a lot for one day. The request for the 7:30 piece was to find a Syrian family arriving by boat and to follow them up until the point they made it to the mainland. So standing there on the beach, my producer Fuad and I were checking out the prospective talent. Amid the mayhem, though, I noticed an old man standing alone by himself, leaning on a cane and quietly crying. Fuad, my producer, quickly came over and we asked the man what was wrong. I've been separated from my wife and my children. I don't know what to do now, he told us. So 61-year-old Syrian refugee Nazir Hussein had just arrived by boat. He had no money, no contact numbers for his children or wife he'd been separated from during the crossing, and no way of walking the 50 kilometres it was going to take to get to Mytilene, the Lesbos capital on the other side of the island, where the boats were leaving to Athens. All Nazir had with him was his cane and his family Quran, which he had carried in a plastic bag all the way from Latakia in Syria. He also hadn't had any water or food for 2 days as he waited in the bushes for the people smugglers to give them the all clear to get on the boat. So despite the fact that Nazir didn't meet the brief we'd been given, and we had many other filing tasks to complete that day, I knew that we couldn't just leave him there. Plus, this was an amazing story, so I thought, why not film it and help at the same time? I should be clear, this is in contrast to what journalism's students are taught to do. And most of my colleagues who study journalism are told not to interfere in a story. So some of my colleagues might see what I did as unethical. Fuad and Aaron Hollett, the ABC's Middle East cameraman who had been assigned to work with me on this trip, agreed though as well. They didn't want to just leave Nazir there on the beach. So we told him, Nazir, not to worry, promising we'd help him get to a safe place and help put him in touch with groups who could begin the search for his loved ones. Our driver on Lesbos had told us that authorities had implemented a new regulation, making it illegal to provide transport to these asylum seekers. But the driver and everyone in our team agreed it was worth the risk to try and help Nazir. So we got him some food and water and began the 2-hour drive to the main port. Mytilene then resembled a refugee camp as thousands of refugees slept rough in the streets while they waited for the ferries to Athens. And we took Nazir to look for his family among all this crowd, but we had no luck finding them. But we heard about a missing persons tent run by the Red Cross, who are always incredible, no matter where I found them on the road. The Red Cross volunteers wrote down Nazir's details and took his photo to add to their family tracing register. We found Nazir a hotel room, so he didn't have to join the thousands of others sleeping on the streets. And Fuad, my producer, gave him some of his own clothes to wear. We still managed to file all our news requirements that day, but we didn't tell our bosses quite how much time we had spent helping Nazir. And the next day, again, looking for Nazir's family, but having no luck, Nazir spotted a Syrian family who had been on his boat when he'd crossed from Turkey. They offered to help him get to Athens and to take him to the address that the Red Cross had given us, where Nazir could be looked after while they looked for his family. So the last shot of our 7:30 story was waving goodbye to Nazir as he got on that ferry. We left Lesbos and flew back to Athens, and I was about to board my flight back to Jerusalem when the Syrian family looking after Nazir called. They were worried the Macedonian border was going to close and they were going to leave Athens right now and wanted to know what they should do with the old man. It was 2 a.m. and I was terrified Nazir might be dumped on the streets of Athens with no ability to communicate, no money and no proper jacket to keep him warm. So I had to go. And this wasn't under the cover of work anymore. Aaron, the cameraman, had flown back to his base in Beirut earlier. So I just went and I spent the next day or so helping Nazir. The Red Cross found him a bed in a camp eventually, and we got a stash of new clothes, cigarettes, and a phone. And I was super careful, using, of course, all my own money, not the ABC's. And at this time, when I left Nazir, I knew he would be safe with the Red Cross until we found his family. And we did. After a few weeks, thanks to Fuad's excellent sleuthing skills, we found them on Facebook and we made part 2 of the story, where we flew to Germany and filmed them all reuniting. But I did get in trouble with my boss at the time. I was told I had crossed the line, that I'd placed too much stress on the team on Lesbos by prioritising helping Nazir. That upset me greatly that they felt that way, but I had absolutely no regrets. PTSD and moral injury are very real risks with this work, and I always found that the best way of avoiding that was to try and help when I could. That avoided that guilt that I saw eat other colleagues up. I always decided to act and think like a humanitarian first and a journalist second. To me, no story was more important than someone's real life. And if I hadn't helped Nazir find his family, I'd be consumed by guilt to this day about what had ever happened to him. And no one could argue that I didn't get a great story out of it, or that it didn't reflect the real facts and the reality of what was going on. I had a similar situation with a doctor I worked with in Syria. Khalid had sent me videos and photos of starving children inside the town of Madaya. Hezbollah and Assad's forces had surrounded that town, and it was the first example of the regime's horrific policy of surrender or starve, which we later saw used throughout the country. The images of these emaciated children that Khalid took and sent to me ended up going viral and were referred to by Samantha Power, the US ambassador to the UN at the time, as she argued for food aid to be let into the town. But after taking these pictures and giving interviews about it, Dr. Khalid became a marked man. Hezbollah explicitly told him they were looking to find someone to pay to kill him. And so he decided he had to get out, and he took the risk of creeping through a field riddled with landmines in the middle of the night, and then he walked for 2 nights to get to Lebanon. And once he arrived in Beirut, Khalid called me. Could I help him? I felt a lot of responsibility because I was the one who'd helped first get those photos and videos out. And Australia had just announced it would take in 11,000 refugees from Syria and Iraq. I'd met some of the immigration officials assigned to the task of processing applicants, so it wasn't difficult to put Khalid in touch with them. And he was approved to go to Australia. We made a wonderful Australian story about Khalid on his journey, his first ever flight, arriving in Australia, and he now lives not far from me in Perth, and next week his wife Jumana is due to give birth to their 3rd child. So again, leading heart first got a great outcome and a great story. In Yemen, ABC cameraman Aaron Hollett and I filmed several children in the Sana'a hospital who were starving to death. It was a horrific result of the Saudi-backed blockade on that country, and we felt like terrible vultures in there, filming these dying, starving, emaciated babies. So my approach in a situation like that was always to sit quietly with the parents and to talk first, to spend the time showing you cared and to give them a bit of dignity before asking if it was okay that we filmed. One little girl, Mtiaz, was 2, but she weighed about as much as a newborn because she was just so skeletal. And she was not being accepted into the ICU at that hospital because her grandma didn't have the $20 US to get her in there. So we paid. There was another little boy called Issa who died several hours after we filmed him and his distraught parents. And the next day we went to film at his family home to show where they had buried the toddler. After we finished filming the family and we said goodbye, I did give the dad some money for food for the other 3 kids. He had expressed fear in the interview that they too might also die of starvation. Did this impact my filming? No. Was I paying for the interview? Certainly not. We'd been filming on and off with them for 4 days already, and he'd been clearly told we didn't pay. He'd spoken passionately about wanting the world to see what was happening to the people of Yemen. Did it alleviate my guilty conscience? A little bit. The story and the people that just haunt you for years. The case of Rahaf Al-Qunun was a bit more complicated. Rahaf was an 18-year-old Saudi asylum seeker escaping domestic abuse and family violence at home. She managed to steal her passport off her brother, get an Aussie tourist visa online, but was stopped at Bangkok airport by Saudi officials who confiscated her passport. It was part of a pattern by Saudi diplomats trying to enforce their obscene treatment of women beyond their borders. Rahaf tweeted that she was at the airport and needed help because she was about to be flown back to Saudi Arabia against her will. I saw the tweets and thought of a previous case like this, which had a terrible outcome. 24-year-old Saudi asylum seeker Dina Ali pleaded for help on Twitter. No one came to her assistance, and Dina was then abducted by her uncles from Manila airport, and she hasn't been heard of publicly since. I remember seeing those tweets by Dina and thinking someone would come and help her, and no one did. So when I saw these tweets from Rahaf, I was on leave at the time from Four Corners trying to finish my book. So I didn't need to ask permission from the ABC before I quickly booked a flight to Thailand and stayed with Rahaf until the UN had taken her into their care and they arranged for her to resettle in Canada. At the time, it was a really big world news story and we had the ultimate scoop because I was there in the room with Rahaf. I filmed the whole process and we made a Four Corners out of it. While my boss, Sally Neighbour at Four Corners backed me fully, some ABC managers didn't like how it played out. While I was still in the hotel room with Rahaf, unsure if we were both going to be arrested by Thai authorities or not quite sure what was going to happen, I got a message on WhatsApp from an ABC manager who said, "I'm concerned about the perception you'll be portrayed as an activist." And in the days after that, when I was doing a lot of interviews on the ABC sent an email around to everyone saying that before I appeared on air, it had to be pointed out that I was on leave writing a book at the time that I was with Rahaf. I think that the belief that reporters have to be dispassionate, neutral observers is built on a fallacy. While I'd never pick a military side in a conflict, I was always firmly on one side, that of the civilians, the women and children, the victims of violence and war crimes, the ones caught in the middle without the power of the gun or the warplanes. I don't think that's attachment or activist journalism. I just believe that centering ethical decision-making at the heart of your journalism makes better journalism. This didn't impact my commitment to the truth of verifying the evidence of getting it right. The people you meet also know if you mean more to them than just a story, and they give you better access and are more honest if they feel they can trust you to act ethically and to make decisions that place their well-being first. It also ensures I now sleep better at night and I'm able to deal with all those ghosts from the road. I don't really have any what ifs, or, thoughts if only I'd helped that man or that woman. I always did try to. I've been told my approach is unique, and that's mostly not as a compliment. And I wonder if it's because I didn't do any formal journalism training. I didn't really know how you're supposed to do it. I didn't really know what the rules were supposed to be. I just did what felt right, what I could live with. But ultimately, I have left the profession. I didn't really feel like I fitted in, or I was able to help enough as a journalist, because it was never just a story for me. What I love about my job now at Human Rights Watch is that it has the best parts of journalism, investigating and exposing abuses, but without some of the bullshit that got me down. Convincing editors to commission me to do stories on unpopular issues that they feared no one would watch. That was always very stressful. Worrying about exclusives. I hated that. Or just knowing that the story was meant to be what I was worrying about the most, not people's actual fates. So my job now is purely ethics driven. At Human Rights Watch, our core values are to be factual, accurate, and ethical in our fact finding. And during my training, when I joined the organization, I learned how a key part of those values was adherence to the principle of do no harm. It wasn't a concept I'd ever really thought deeply about before, though I was aware of its application in the medical field and in social work. But when I thought about it, it really summarized what I had tried to achieve with my journalism. And I do think it's worth considering when examining ethics codes for journalists, particularly when operating in conflict zones and with traumatized people. And I dearly hope it's taught to the next generation of young reporters. Thank you very much for listening.